You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, and thank you for joining the American Revolution. This week, episode 369, The First Bank of the United States. In our last regular episode, we covered some of the final events of the second session of the First Congress and the midterm elections that were held mostly in the fall of 1790. Congress did return to a third session in December of 1790 after these elections, which met back in Philadelphia. Before I get into the third session of Congress, I do want to touch on one more event that happened back in the second session when we were still back in New York. I talked before in earlier episodes that Congress had created a tariff package and began raising revenue. The problem with import tariffs, as the leaders well knew from the colonial era, was smuggling. It was pretty easy for merchant vessels to avoid tariffs by simply offloading their goods away from the main ports and avoiding the customs officials. To enforce tariffs, on the recommendation of Secretary of Treasury Alexander Hamilton, Congress authorized the creation of the Revenue Marine. 10 ships would be built to control the coast and enforce federal tariffs. 2 ships were made for New England, 2 for New York, 1 for Delaware Bay, 2 for the Chesapeake, and 2 more for the Carolinas and Georgia. Now, to get congressional support, Hamilton had each cutter built in the state where it would be used, thus creating local government jobs. He also had the master of each ship oversee its construction. Now, these were relatively small ships. Hamilton limited the cost to $1,000 per ship, although several of them ended up exceeding that amount. They were designed to be fast, with shallow drafts so that they could chase down ships anywhere along the coast. Each ship had a crew of 10 and a few swivel guns to ensure compliance. Now, you have to remember the U.S. had no navy at this time, and the ships were not designed to confront enemy warships. These were small coastal enforcement vessels under the authority of the Department of Treasury, and they would take orders from the local customs house. The main significance of the Revenue Marine is that they were the forerunner of the U.S. Coast Guard, so its creation date, August 4th, 1790, is often used as the birth date for the U.S. Coast Guard. Now, as I said, Congress returned for its third session in Philadelphia in December of 1790. As I said last week, this was after most states had held elections for the Second Congress, so many of those attending were lame ducks, although that term wasn't used yet. About 1/3 of the House members had either retired or lost election, but they still continued in their work in this first Congress. Back when the Continental Congress had met in Philadelphia, they met in what we call today Independence Hall. At the time, that was the Pennsylvania State House, where the state legislature met. It had also been used by Philadelphia city officials. Now, because Pennsylvania was trying to convince the U.S. Congress to remain permanently, they were doing everything they could to encourage Congress to stay and be comfortable in Philadelphia. Now, the state had just completed a new county courthouse right next to the State House. They gave this building to Congress. Pennsylvania officials tried to set up the rooms similar to the way they had been in Federal Hall back in New York. New chairs and desks were laid out in a similar pattern as they had been in New York, and the Senate was decorated with a huge portrait, actually 2 portraits, one of King Louis of France and the other of his wife, Queen Marie Antoinette. These paintings had been gifts from the King and Queen. The House took over the first floor. The Senate needed only half of the second floor. Members of both bodies did not have separate offices. Rather, they had desks on the floor of the House and Senate, which they used to keep their personal papers. They generally sat on the floor all day when Congress was in session, and in fact, members were required to remain seated unless speaking. They could not get up and roam around the floor. The state legislature would continue to meet in the State House, which is the main building, as we call Independence Hall today. On the other side of that hall, officials had built another building which would be used by the mayor of Philadelphia and other city officials as the new city hall. So federal, state, and local governments all worked together on the same block. And the Supreme Court ended up using City Hall when the justices met in session. Now, not only was Congress moving to Philadelphia, so was most of the executive branch. The influx of people led to some overcrowding. Landlords doubled their rental rates as city builders went on a housing boom. Even before Congress arrived, government officials began carting government records and other items from New York to Philadelphia. The Pennsylvania legislature, still hoping to tempt the government to remain permanently, authorized the construction of a large presidential mansion with a big dome on top. It was built on the western edge of town, on 9th Street, about 3 blocks from Congress. They had gotten as far as setting the cornerstone before the federal government arrived, but the house would not be completed for another 7 years. It became less urgent when President Washington made clear that he would not live in the new house. Instead, the president rented a house owned by Robert Morris. It was considered the nicest house in the city. General William Howe had occupied the home during the British occupation of Philadelphia. The house was just 1 block north of Congress. Morris, perhaps the wealthiest man in America at the time, had purchased the house in 1780. Washington had been a house guest there during the Constitutional Convention. Morris offered the house for President Washington to use exclusively, and the Morris family moved out entirely, taking residence next door. Washington agreed to rent the home, but the state of Pennsylvania ended up paying the rent, again trying to encourage the federal government to stay in Philadelphia. Washington's personal secretary, Tobias Lear, oversaw the move of all Washington's furniture and other items, a total of 58 wagon loads from New York to Philadelphia, setting up the new presidential residence. Washington ordered considerable changes made to the house, including even tearing down an entire wall so that he could add large windows. Other members were also moving into the city. James Madison, still a bachelor, just rented a room in a boarding house 2 blocks away from the president. Thomas Jefferson, a widower, also just took a small room several blocks away. He rented a house on Market Street, using the upstairs as his residence. The ground floor became the offices for the State Department. Alexander Hamilton moved into a house with his wife and children on Walnut Street. He was only a block from the Treasury Department, which continued to expand during the government's time in Philadelphia. Secretary of War Henry Knox, who was quite wealthy, rented a larger house for his family. The War Department took up quarters in several buildings, including for a time in Carpenter's Hall, where the First Continental Congress had met years earlier. Pennsylvania leaders were doing everything they could to accommodate the new federal leaders, again hoping to convince them that they would remain in the city after the 10-year period expired. Meanwhile, Congress returned to work on December 6, 1790, beginning that 3rd session. Well, it actually had to wait a day before enough members arrived to reach a quorum, but that was better than the weeks they had had to wait to begin their first session back in New York a couple years earlier. The biggest item on the agenda became Alexander Hamilton's proposal to create a national bank. Now, in the 1790s, banks were a relatively new concept. The Bank of England was less than 100 years old. The first bank in America was Robert Morris's Bank of North America, which had been established in 1781. Banks in this era were not commercial establishments for people to save money as they are today. The Bank of England was designed to borrow funds essentially from wealthy investors to finance wars or other major government expenses. Customers did not create savings accounts. Rather, they became shareholders by putting their money into the venture. And because the banks held a large amount of gold and silver, people would accept banknotes as currency, knowing that they could exchange their notes at any time for that gold or silver. The bank could issue more paper money under the hope that not everyone who was holding the notes would try to exchange them for hard currency all at one time, so it allowed much more money to circulate. The Bank of England had allowed the government to place secure money collected from taxes and then borrow larger sums during wartime to fund increased costs of a war. This permitted Britain to sustain wars that were much longer than other European powers who had to impose massive taxes during wartime. The Bank of North America, which had been established by Robert Morris and Alexander Hamilton back in 1781, had tried to do the same thing in America to help finance the Revolution. The Bank of North America banknotes did hold their value pretty much, unlike what we saw with continental currency. Initially, the Bank of North America held a charter from the Confederation Congress, but it took a lot of criticism that Congress was overreaching its authority and that the bank gave too much power to a few wealthy men. To avoid the criticism of congressional overreach, the bank got a new charter from the state of Pennsylvania, but even there it had problems as the populist government did not like the power that the bank was giving to the moneyed interests in the state. After a few years, a second bank opened in America. The Bank of New York was established after the war in 1784. A group of New York investors saw how profitable the Bank of North America was in Philadelphia and how the bank made it easier to raise investment money for new commercial projects. Among the original investors in the Bank of New York were Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr. So when it came time to establish a financial system for the new federal government, Hamilton proposed creating a national bank chartered by Congress. This bank would be set up in ways similar to these earlier banks. It would acquire capital both from private investors and from government tax collections. The government could use much of the money raised to begin paying off its war debt. The bank would also offer loans to private companies and would provide a paper currency to circulate easily while retaining its value. Hamilton based his proposal for a national bank on the earlier models. In his report to Congress, he pointed out that money in the bank would be put to active use in the economy, unlike the traditional pattern of having merchants simply locking up their money in a chest and hiding it away. This would let other people make use of that money right away, while the owner of the money earned interest. Another advantage would be that the government could gain access to capital very quickly if the need arose. It would make it easier for people to pay taxes. It would improve the credit reputation of the U.S. among both citizenry and foreign bankers, and it would help to lower interest rates given the ease and availability of money available to borrow. Hamilton wanted the bank to be a public-private partnership. The bank would hold specie from both private investors as well as government tax revenues. He envisioned a capital stock of over $10 million, offering 25,000 shares in the bank at $400 each. Investors could use public debt, that is, those old continental dollars, to pay for up to 3/4 of the purchase price, but the rest would have to be paid in specie, that is, gold or silver. Investors would receive an interest of 6% per year. That return would encourage investment. When paying out money, it would be in the form of banknotes, allowing the bank to retain specie to maintain its public confidence. Now, of course, Hamilton's proposed bank had its opponents. Rather quickly, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison became the leaders of this opposition. Now, neither of them were opponents of banking generally, at least they hadn't been in the past. Jefferson had actually been an investor in the Bank of North America. Madison had expressed some misgivings about the Bank of North America when he was in the Confederation Congress, but he ended up voting for it. Jefferson and Madison, though, had both acquiesced to Hamilton's debt assumption plan in the earlier session. Both were growing increasingly concerned at just how powerful the federal government was becoming. The main argument used by the opposition was that the Constitution did not authorize a bank. Madison reminded his colleagues that the Constitutional Convention had actually debated and rejected the idea of giving the federal government the power to grant charters or articles of incorporation. His view was that if the authorization for such power was not explicitly written in the Constitution, then the government did not have that power. Supporters, however, argued that the Constitution's necessary and proper clause granted Congress the power to do anything that was necessary and proper to carrying out its other duties. Since Congress had the authority to collect taxes, spend money, and pay off its debts, a bank would be a key component of that. Jefferson also noted that the 10th Amendment reserved undelegated powers to the states, not the federal government, but the 10th Amendment hadn't even been ratified yet. The Jefferson-Madison view of interpreting the Constitution became known as strict construction. It basically meant if the power was not expressly delegated, they would construe the Constitution very strictly to mean that the government did not have that power. Hamilton's loose construction of the Constitution also set a dangerous precedent. If Congress could just make any argument for creating a new thing that had not been explicitly authorized by the Constitution, there would be no stopping point. The government could just grow to do just about anything. Even most Federalists who wanted a more powerful federal government after the Confederation feared the idea of a national government with unlimited authority to do anything. Now, beyond this legal argument, there were reasons for opposing the bank. The post-war era had been rife with political dissension between farmers and working people against the wealthy merchants and bankers. This new bank seemed to give special privileges and advantages to a small group of moneyed interests at the expense of everybody else. In particular, the bank would tend to benefit merchants and businessmen in the cities at the expense of farmers and others. Now, this was a time when the vast majority of the population worked as farmers. They had come to see financial institutions and loans as their enemy, making this project highly unpopular. The South especially, where there was very little commercial activity outside of farming, was concerned about how much power a bank would move toward northern interests. Some politicians feared that establishing a bank in Philadelphia might also be a reason why the government would not want to relocate to the Potomac after the agreed 10-year period in Philadelphia. Opponents also saw the bank as a source of political corruption. It was the case in Britain that members of Parliament often held stock in the Bank of England, which gave them a self-interested position in supporting anything that benefited the bank. It would also certainly be the case that members of Congress would invest in the Bank of the United States and have that same conflict of interest. The idea that the bulk of the nation's wealth would cause even greater wealth to accrue to a small number of wealthy and powerful men, which would disadvantage everyone else. A bank would also promote speculation. With so much money to be made through investment, Jefferson warned that the people would turn their lives towards speculation rather than being productive workers. Speculation, unlike labor, had no benefit to the country and was essentially a form of gambling. It would be destructive of morality. Hamilton submitted his report in mid-December 1790, at the beginning of the third session of Congress. The Senate took up the bill first, proposing a 20-year charter for the bank. A minority wanted to limit that charter to 10 years, but that effort failed. Relatively quickly, by the end of January, the Senate passed a bank bill by a pretty decisive vote of 10-6. The House took up the bill at the beginning of February, when Madison rose to oppose it, raising the issues that I just outlined. Congress, however, was under a pretty strict deadline. Since the first Congress had begun in early March 1789, Congress had to wrap up by that same date in 1791. Otherwise, members would be serving longer than 2 years in violation of the Constitution. At that point, they would have to be replaced by the new members who were elected in the most recent elections. So the House just debated the bill for only a week. At the end of the week, they called a vote, passing overwhelmingly by a vote of 39-20. Congress waited another week before presenting the bill to President Washington. Both sides used that extra time to draft arguments for their side. The day before the bill reached Washington's desk, Attorney General Edmund Randolph issued an opinion that the bill was unconstitutional. A day after Washington received the bill, Jefferson presented his own argument that the bank was unconstitutional. Washington, uncertain about what he would do, asked Madison to draft a veto message just in case he decided to veto the bill. At the same time, Hamilton raced to complete his own lengthy argument on why the bank was constitutional. The Constitution gave the president 10 days to decide whether to sign a bill or veto it. Hamilton finally submitted his arguments on day 8. Hamilton essentially argued that the president should defer to the legislature and that the Constitution gave the government implied powers to create new institutions that were necessary and proper to the running of government. The debate over the controversial bill weighed heavily on President Washington. His thoughts weren't really focused on whether the bank was a good idea. He seemed more concerned about whether he would be violating the Constitution by signing it or being seen as not deferential enough to the legislature by vetoing it. The bill had passed with nearly 2/3 support in both houses, so a veto override was quite possible, and Washington would see that as an embarrassment. The bill also was particularly unpopular in his home state of Virginia. So Washington considered his options, waiting until the last possible minute, but he did end up accepting Hamilton's arguments and signed the bill. The Bank of the United States would begin operation a few months later. Next week, we're going to look into another controversy about whether Vermont should join the Union as the 14th state. Hey, thanks for joining the American Revolution Podcast After Show, part of the Airwave Media Network. Thanks to my Patreon supporters in the Alexander Hamilton Club, George Davis, Michael Mulhert, and Mitchell Anderson. I also want to thank Robert Morris Circle supporters, TJ Walker, and Curtis Johnson. And give a welcome to Keith Mello, who recently joined at the standard bearer level. Keith has already received his first flag magnet for his support at the $10 level on Patreon. I really do appreciate everyone who can help me to keep this podcast going. Everyone who makes an ongoing contribution on Patreon helps to allow me to continue producing more episodes. Also, thanks to David Hubbard, who gave me a one-time gift on Venmo. For those of you who want to make a one-time gift as opposed to an ongoing subscription, I really appreciate those who can give some support via PayPal or Venmo. Also, I've received a large number of cancellations of support over the last month, especially some of my larger donors. I really would appreciate if anyone who has canceled would let me know why. If the podcast has just gotten too far away from the war, I'd like to know that. If it's just gotten too uninteresting for you in other ways, I appreciate that feedback as well. If it's too many commercials or some other thing, whatever it is, it's important for me to know so that I can make changes to the podcast to keep it interesting for everyone. Your feedback is critical to that. So I'm grateful for any support you've ever given, and if you need to end for personal reasons, I certainly understand. But any feedback on why you've stopped contributing would help me to make this podcast better. Now, this week, I gave a brief mention on the establishment of the forerunner of the Coast Guard. The Revenue Marine, as it was originally known, became known later as the Revenue Cutter Service during the Civil War. And around that same time, the government established the United States Life-Saving Services to assist with saving shipwrecked mariners. So this was really two separate agencies. The Cutter Service was about stopping smugglers. The Life-Saving Service was about helping people with shipwrecks. Shortly after the Civil War, in 1871, the Treasury Department created a formal service for the life-saving part with full-time crews. Now, these two organizations operated separately until they were merged together to form the U.S. Coast Guard in 1915. In the 1920s, Congress actually considered merging the whole thing into the U.S. Navy, but ended up deciding to keep it separate. After the merger, the Coast Guard remained entirely within the Department of Treasury. In 1967, it moved to the Department of Transportation, and then in 2003, it would be transferred again into the new Department of Homeland Security. I also talked briefly about the presidential mansion that had been built by Pennsylvania and was never occupied by either president. It was completed in time for John Adams to move in at the beginning of his term, but Adams refused. He argued that he could not accept the residence without the approval of Congress, which did not give it. After the federal government moved to D.C. in 1800, the city sold the property at public auction. It was purchased by the University of Pennsylvania, and the university tore down the building in 1829 to make room for two newer buildings on the property. Now, of course, my main issue this week was the Bank of the United States. I get that discussing banking legislation probably isn't as interesting to you as discussing battles, but the political divides that formed after the war really set the course for the new nation. And it's great to remember the bravery on the battlefield, and we should do that. But we also need to know how politics created the government and society that still impacts us today, and the bank was a huge part of that. We can trace the fight over the bank as one of the first major rifts in the new government, particularly isolating Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson was particularly upset that Washington had sided with Hamilton on this one. Also, a short time after its passage, Jefferson received a copy of Thomas Paine's new book, The Rights of Man, which he wanted published in America. And when he did that, Jefferson included a note to the printer and in his note commented that the book confronted some of the, quote, political heresies that were being spread among the country. Jefferson's comments were directed at a new book written by Vice President John Adams. Jefferson later said that he never planned for his note to be published, and certainly not with his name attached to it, but it did happen, and that created a deep split between Jefferson and Adams that would last for decades. So these two events, the bank and the book, tended to isolate Jefferson in the administration and probably eventually led to his departure from the cabinet. Jefferson just thought the administration was moving in the wrong direction. The issue of large and powerful bankers being against the interests of regular folks it's a fight that continues to this day. But the battle became particularly divisive around the national bank. And Southerners in particular saw the growth and power to Northern business interests as a threat to their fundamental way of life. The bank was set up fairly quickly. It initially set up in Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia, where the First Continental Congress had met so many years earlier. It began selling investments to the public on July 4th, 1791, just a few months after the bill had been passed. It was so popular with investors that would-be investors mobbed the building on the first day, and the bank was oversubscribed within an hour after it opened. Now, that said, the bank remained highly controversial. Its permanent building was only completed a couple years before the capital moved to Washington. The bank remained in operation in Philadelphia. When it came time to renew the bank's charter in 1811, then President Madison refused to do so. A private banker by the name of Girard bought the building and the stock to form his own private bank, which was called Girard Bank. Now, I can remember Girard Bank, which was still in operation until 1983, when it got bought out by Mellon Bank and was eventually resold to become Citizens Bank. But this was a very long-standing private bank, at least in the Philadelphia area. After Jefferson refused to renew the charter in 1811, the government struggled to operate without a bank. Eventually, Madison had to admit defeat and chartered the Second Bank of the United States in 1816. That controversy, though, continued through several more presidents until President Andrew Jackson refused to renew the charter of the Second Bank, causing it to close in 1836. Now, by the time Jackson vetoed the Second Bank, private banks had become much more common throughout the country. In fact, the Second Bank also became a private bank for a little while, being chartered in Pennsylvania. It folded a few years later, though. The government started keeping its assets in private banks and remaining out of the banking business, at least until the establishment of the Federal Reserve in 1913. And my book recommendation this week is The Hamilton Scheme, An Epic Tale of Money and Power in the American Founding, by William Hoagland. If you want to learn more about how Hamilton essentially built a new economic system for the United States and did his best to crush those who opposed it, this book covers that topic very well. It's a relatively new book, released in 2024. Hoagland is a well-established author who has written several interesting books on the early federal era. So if you want to learn more about this whole thing, get a copy of The Hamilton Scheme, An Epic Tale of Money and Power in the American Founding by William Hoagland. My online recommendation is Hamilton's report to President Washington in support of the National Bank. This is a pretty lengthy document. It's not book length, but for something that was written within a week or two, it's pretty thorough. If you look at my blog, I've also included links to the objections written by Edmund Randolph and Thomas Jefferson, as well as Madison's proposed veto message. But I chose Hamilton's report as my recommendation this week because if you want to read just one thing, this is what you want to read because Hamilton's vision is the vision that won out in the end. Of course, as always, I've included links on my blog and in my episode notes. My question this week is, did the American revolutionaries have sympathizers in England? The answer is yes. A great many Whigs, especially the so-called radical Whigs, supported the American cause. They believed the colonists had raised valid issues over taxation without representation and wanted the government to negotiate a fair solution rather than go to war. When the colonists declared independence, Whig support for the cause waned, but it did still remain. As the war dragged on, this support grew louder again. One prominent leader of this movement was John Wilkes, who was at this time Lord Mayor of London. Another was Isaac Barra, who had invented the term Sons of Liberty for a speech in Parliament years before the war. Yet another supporter was William Pitt, who spoke strongly against the war with the colonies in his final years. Lord Camden led a faction in the House of Lords that opposed the war. Another was Lord Rockingham, who was also in opposition during the war. He's the one who eventually became prime minister and approved the final peace treaty with America, recognizing independence and ending the war. One surprising name on this list of supporters was General William Howe, who also served in the House of Commons before the war began. At that time, he vowed that he would never agree to serve in a military position where he would be required to attack his fellow Englishmen in the colonies. He obviously got over that position when he was appointed the commander of British forces in North America. But even in that position, you can see how he was reluctant to crush the enemy and still hoped to negotiate a peace with the colonists after showing British power. His brother, Lord Richard Howe, had similar views. Lord Howe corresponded with Benjamin Franklin before the war, and Franklin had been close friends with his sister, Caroline Howe. There were, of course, many other supporters of the American cause. Not all of them were prominent leaders in the British government. One of the commoners was a guy named John Aitken, who took it upon himself to sabotage the Royal Navy dockyards to help the Americans, and he was hanged for his efforts. I talked about him in an earlier episode. There were also others in the popular masses as well. The Gordon riots of 1780 were in part anti-war riots. Some of the rioters had sympathy with the Americans. Others just wanted the war to be over. If you have a question you'd like me to answer, please reach out to me either via email or on X, Facebook, Quora, or Reddit. Well, that's all for this week. I hope you will join me again next week for another American Revolution podcast.